Part 2 of my lecture on Lucretius. I'm going to jump to Book 3 to see how Lucretius argues that when we follow truth by means of philosophical reasoning, any fear of death that we might have will be dispelled. In particular, Lucretius will argue that once we have a correct understanding of the nature of mind and spirit, we can then toss out the dread of death. So pause here to read. Before focusing on the fear of death, Lucretius once again argues that philosophical reasoning will prove that there is no good reason to fear the gods and the uncertainty of the future that results from their unpredictable actions. Pause here. Lucretius also argues that rational thinking will show that there's no good reason to fear an ultimate punishment for bad deeds. Indeed, he argues, the fear of such an afterlife makes one's life on earth a living hell. Pause again. Lucretius goes on to argue that fear and dread of death can be tossed out on its ear if we have a better understanding of the nature of the mind, the spirit, and the soul. So let's now take a look at his argument showing that the soul is both physical and mortal, and thus nothing about a person survives the death of the body. First, notice that Stallings explains that she is using the terms mind and intellect interchangeably. In footnote 8, she tells us that anima is translated as spirit and is not really soul, but the vital principle. And by vital principle, most early philosophers meant that which moves a thing that can move on its own. So anything that can move itself does so by its spirit. So anima is translated as the vital principle or spirit, and animus is translated as intellect or mind. Now, Lucretius first argues that the intellect or mind is part of the physical body. Pause to read. And he then argues that mind and spirit are bound together and combined to make the soul. Pause again. Lucretius provides many other arguments in support of the claim that the soul is the combination of the mind and spirit. Here are two such arguments. Pause to read them. Lucretius also provides this evidence to support the claim that the spirit and mind are combined and are part of the physical body. Again, pause to read. Lucretius believes that certain experiences, like the experience of feeling frightened, provide evidence that the mind, soul, and body are all physical. When we experience a shock or sudden fright, we can feel the sensation through our body. There's a certain surge of energy throughout the limbs, and we break out in a cold sweat and feel faint. According to Lucretius, all of those physical sensations that are experienced by the physical body are caused by the spirit. And since the spirit is affecting the physical body in physical ways, it must be the case that the spirit is physical, since only something physical can affect something else that is physical. Lucretius explains. Pause here to read. So by philosophical reasoning, we can first observe that in a human body, fear affects the mind and spirit that then causes the physical body to react. And since a physical body can react only if it is caused to do so by something else that is physical, Lucretius concludes that the mind and spirit must also be physical. Lucretius also puts forth many arguments to show that minds and spirits cannot be immortal, but are instead mortal, coming into existence at some point and going out of existence at some later time. So he writes that minds and flimsy spirits have a birthday and an end. And he argues, body and mind are born together. We sense that this is true, and they mature together and grow old together too. And old age wears them down alike and fritters them away. And he concludes, it follows, therefore, that the mind must also have a share in death. Here's another argument that Lucretius uses to argue against the view that the spirit is immortal and non-physical. If the spirit's nature is immortal and we claim that it can feel sensation even separate from our frame, I suppose we must endow it with the five senses as well. How else do we envision phantoms roving down in hell? This argument might be fun to assess and evaluate in a discussion section. In any case, we've seen that Lucretius argues that the mind, soul, and spirit are all physical. It's interesting to note that the claim that the soul is physical and dies with the body would not have been new to Western thought. Indeed, the earliest Western philosophers took for granted that the soul must be physical. The view that the soul is non physical may have been introduced to the West in the mid 500s BCE by Pythagoras, who traveled to Egypt and learned about the theory of transmigration, the view that the soul survives the death of the body and enters a new body. And it may be the case that Pythagoras then returned to Italy and taught his followers to believe that the soul is immortal and migrates from one body to another. Indeed, it may well be the case that Plato was influenced by Pythagoras' thinking. This line of influence does make you think, if Pythagoras had never traveled to Egypt, would Westerners have such a strong belief in an immortal, non physical soul? Well, in any case, let's go on to Lucretius's main point. He argues that when we follow reason, we'll come to see that because we are fully mortal and no part of us will survive the death of the body, we cannot fear death. So he writes, a person should not be tormented by what hasn't happened yet, sick with dread, worn out with fretting, or gnawed at with regret for sins that were committed sometime in the past. According to Lucretius, each of us is a physical body combined with a physical soul, which is itself a combination of the physical mind and physical spirit. And as such, when a person dies, there's nothing about a person that survives, and so nothing that can retain memories, that can be conscious, or can be that person. It follows that death is nothing to us. It concerns us not a jot, seeing we hold the mind is mortal. Lucretius then writes, for if someone will ail and suffer at some future day, they must exist in that time when the maladies beset. But death removes the possibility, since death won't let the person exist for whom these ills are hoarded up. It's clear, therefore, that death is absolutely nothing we need fear, and that he who is not cannot be wretched or forlorn. What can it matter to the man that he was even born, once deathless death despoils him and his mortal life is shorn? And he also writes, if they could see it clearly and their words followed in kind, they'd free themselves from heavy dread and anguish of the mind. One thing rises from another, it will never cease. No one is given life to own, we all hold but a lease. Look back again, how the endless ages of time come to pass. Before our birth are nothing to us. This is a looking glass nature holds up for us, in which we see the time to come after we finally die. What is there that looks so fearsome? What's so tragic? Isn't it more peaceful than any sleep? Can you remember what it was like before you were conceived? No, of course not. You weren't in existence yet. And so there was no you to experience anything. Were you afraid before you were conceived? No, again, of course not, for there was no you to feel fear. Well, if there isn't going to be any you after your body dies, then it'll be just like it was before you were conceived. And since you didn't have any fear of that, you shouldn't have any fear of death. Lucretius argues that if we could just see this clear enough, each of us would easily and happily accept our eventual eternal death. Pause to read this slide. And he ends Book 3 with this. Pause again. Okay, so Lucretius has argued that religious and superstitious thinking about hell and an immortal soul actually leads to more fear. In Book 3, he argues that when we follow philosophical and rational thinking, we'll come to see that the human person is entirely physical, and so nothing about us survives the death of the body, and so there will be nothing to experience anything, and so there's no need to fear death. This ends Part 2.